Öncelikle İngilizce konuştuğum için özür diliyorum. Fakat eğer Türkçe konuşsan ben dahil kimse anlayamaz. However, it is good to speak in English because it is the international language, and I consider Niyazi to be an international thinker. If you put the name Niyazi Mısri into Google, there are an amazingly high number of results, 172,000. Approximately half the entries for someone even more well-known, Ibn Arabi, you would think. However, only 6 entries I could find in English, 1 for a Facebook page in Turkish, the remaining 5 an encyclopedia entry, a brief and not very informative biography, and 3 poems in loose translation. Unusually, not a single scholarly article or translation in English at all, or in French, or in German, or any other European language. All the other Google entries are in Turkish. Even if we consult the latest edition of the Encyclopedia of Islam, the brief 800-word article makes no mention of any study in English apart from one, J.B. Brown's The Dervishes, published in 1927. In other words, what is striking is that Niyazi Mısri may be well known and even venerated here in Turkey, but he remains hardly known at all in the non-Turkish speaking world. Of course, this is not an isolated example of Ottoman literary obscurity. There are many figures, especially Sufi authors such as Molla Fenari, Aziz Mahmud Hudayi, Ismail Ankaravi, Sheikh Ghalib, who are equally unknown and ignored in the West at the present moment. Such a phenomenon is complicated by the rupture between the old Ottoman Empire and the modern Middle East, with its assortment of new nation states. This is a rupture which is not political or social or linguistic only, it is also a matter of deep cultural identity. As the Ottoman scholar Victoria Holbrook has observed, no state has instituted Ottoman culture as its past, although Turkey may now be in the process of recuperating it. It is therefore with the greatest hope and delight that I welcome this conference, which seeks to revive the heritage of one of the great Sufi masters of Ottoman literature, whose poems retain such a dear place within the hearts of Turks today, and whose vision of truth still inspires so many. I congratulate the organizers for their vision and enthusiasm, and I'm greatly honored as a complete outsider and non-specialist in Niyazi Mısri to have been asked to speak to this esteemed audience. This paper is about the spiritual confluence of Ibn Arabi and Niyazi Mısri, not influence. Of course, there is no doubt that Niyazi was much influenced by Ibn Arabi, and he mentions his indebtedness in many places, singing the praises of the Sheikh al-Akbar, whose Fusus he describes as an ocean. By confluence, I mean simply the way in which both authors give voice to their mystical experience and their vision of humanity. But first, the first aspect of their confluence is the Malatyan soil of my title. Anybody who checks history books or encyclopedias for details of Malatya, or its older incarnation as the Assyrian Melida or Roman Melita, comes across a wealth of material on this old established town of eastern Anatolia. However, reflecting the bias of many historians towards events of the outer world, very little is ever written about the inner history, or the history of its intellectual and spiritual masters, of which there have been many. As you know, the Seljuk Sultan Khosrow I came to Konya, back to his throne in Konya in 1205, and a host of scholars were invited to adorn the kingdom, to bring their expertise and help create a new ordered Muslim state. One of these was Muhyiddin ibn Arabi. Without going into too many details, let me simply note that Ibn Arabi had direct contact with Anatolia over a period of some 15 years, at least 6 of which seem to have centered on Malatya. We know that his daughter and second son were born there, as was his stepson, the foremost exponent of Ibn Arabi's teachings, Sadruddin al-Qunawi. We also know from the manuscript base that Ibn Arabi was involved in teaching and writing for extended periods in Malatya. It was home to him in a way that only Damascus would later match. Not only did this period sow the seeds for the establishment of Ibn Arabi as one of the central figures of the Ottoman intellectual landscape, through teachers such as Qunawi and his library in Konya, but there also remained a much less evident heritage in the form of a succession of students of Ibn Arabi's writings in Anatolia. For example, an important Alawi family in Malatya, who in the late 7th, 13th century transmitted Ibn Arabi's works as well as the Diwan of Ibn al-Farid. Such continuity of human contact and transmission is far harder to map than historical buildings such as an Ulu Jami or a madrasa. But it is entirely to be expected, and from time to time one finds mention of Malatya as a place boasting a strong spiritual tradition, especially amongst Naqshbandis, Qadiris, and Khalvetis. Some 400 years after Ibn Arabi, Shamsuddin Muhammad bin Ali, better known as Niyazi Mısri, was born in 1618 in the summer town of Aspuzi. He began his religious education and also his Sufi training at the hand of a Helveti Sheikh, Hussein Effendi. However, as with most people, his real inner education began elsewhere, away from the familiarity of his hometown, beginning with Cairo, with a dream of Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. In the dream, Niyazi was addressed by Abdul Qadir, who appeared as a sultan. He was addressed as a Sufi and given a pouch with silver and gold coins in it, representing, he was told, outward knowledge and knowledge of the way, respectively. And he was told to look for his guide outside Egypt. Gold and silver is a familiar motif in mystical experience. Silver represents the last but one stage in the sevenfold alchemical process of transformation, the highest quality that can characterize the relative being. It stands for the clothing of servanthood and receptivity, but it is still not the true fulfillment of human potential. That is represented only by gold, the final stage, also paradoxically the first. This Mısrian vision of coins, of course, echoes the famous vision of Ibn Arabi in Mecca, in which gold and silver bricks were depicted. Leaving Egypt, Niyazi found the guide indicated by Abdul Qadir in the form of a Helveti Sheikh Ummi Sinan of El Mali, with whom he spent 9 years in Bursa, and then was sent to Ushak, with Ummi Sinan saying, "You will see that our Mısri Muhammad dervish will be contained in neither Ushak nor Bursa nor any other land. He will be a well-known guide and one of those abiding in the station of polehood, the Qutb." This promise was to be amply fulfilled, as Niyazi Mısri has become someone more renowned even than his own master. The 413 manuscripts listed to his name in Turkish libraries testify to the popularity of his works. What we may note is that the names by which this Muhammad bin Ali, and notice Ibn Arabi was also named Muhammad bin Ali, the names by which this Muhammad would be known in the world, Niyazi Mısri, both express something of his own development. Mısri means something outward to do with the world of appearance and the seeker. For it was this that characterized him at the beginning of his seeking. For example, he says in his diwan, "Don't ask who if you see Mısri with outward eyes. For within the qaf of outward form, anqa we have become." On the other hand, the name Niyazi expresses something more intimate, unseen, and mysterious, and to do with the inner world. Again from the diwan, "O Niyazi, what they call body, heart, and spirit are just aspect within aspect within aspect." It is said that the name Niyazi was used for poems composed at night, while Mısri was used for poems composed during the daytime. Unlike the obvious meaning of physical night and day, anyone familiar with Ibn Arabi's teaching would immediately recognize night is the symbol of the ghaib, the unseen world, and day is symbol of the shuhud, the visible world. For Ibn Arabi, as for Niyazi, the full human being comprises both aspects, night and day, spiritual and physical, inner and outer. So he was known as Niyazi Mısri in respect of his spiritual achievements and rank and appearance, more than as Malaty from Malatya, as that was simply his physical bodily origin. Even though in one of his poems in the Diwan, he celebrates his hometown of Aspuzi, calling it the rose garden of nightingales, the gathering place for the joyful assembly of saints. But let's move beyond the physical connection in relation to Malatyan soil. It is clear that Niyazi was steeped in the writings of Ibn Arabi and Sadruddin Qanawi. In his final work in Arabic, Mawa'id al-Irfan, he often quotes from both Fusus and Futuhat and various shorter treatises. He gives extracts from Sadruddin's commentary on Hadith and his Ijaz al-Bayan. And in short, in this work, he presents himself less as Naqshbandi or Helveti and more as Akbari. But what does it mean to be Akbari, an Akbarian? The term has become popular in modern writing to distinguish certain figures in Sufism as those who follow the teaching of Ash-Shaykh al-Akbar, Ibn Arabi. In 2001, Vincent Cornell titled an article, "Practical Sufism, an Akbarian Foundation for a Liberal Theology of Difference." He speaks of Akbarian theology, the Akbarian perspective. Some people now speak of Akbarian Sufism, the Akbarian school or Akbarian studies. Of course, we can cite a long line of authors from Qanavi onwards who would be part of the Akbarian school, Dawood al-Qaisari, Abdullah Razak al-Khashani, and so on and so on. However, Ibn Arabi did not found a tariqah, and there were no particular prescribed practices in his teaching. The term Akbarian is often used as a shorthand to describe those, particularly writers, who were influenced directly by his writing. And yet, we know from the manuscript evidence that the term Ash-Shaykh al-Akbar was never used in reference to Ibn Arabi prior to the Ottoman conquest of Egypt. Nobody described themselves as Akbari rather than Helveti or Qadiri until much later in the Ottoman Empire, when it was appended to certain sheikhs as their nisbah, particularly under the influence of Abdul Ghani and Nabulsi. In other words, the use of the term Akbari says as much about the perceived political, intellectual, and tariqa landscape within Ottoman society as it does about Ibn Arabi himself. However, today, the word Akbarian does point to an aspect of Ibn Arabi's teaching that is necessary to bring out, that it represents a watershed in terms of external and internal history. As Michel Chodkiewicz has remarked, and I quote, "The age of Ibn Arabi must be regarded as the start of a new era, a period of transition in Sufi doctrine from implicit to explicit, the start of its transition from informality to formality. Its fundamental concepts were defined and organized in the work of Ibn Arabi into a comprehensive synthesis, and from then on, viewed as a summit or as a target, acknowledged or unacknowledged. For followers and adversaries alike, this work constituted an essential landmark and a fruitful source of technical terminology." End of quote. I would like to add that this is not only a historical factor, but a trans-historical one. The impact of Ibn Arabi's teaching upon any individual of any time and any place also has the capacity to be a watershed within that person's life, an essential landmark which dictates later development. It may be described as the realization that one is no longer describable as this or that. One is no longer within this or that group, no longer one of us as opposed to one of them. Put simply, someone who has lost all name in the face of divine reality. It's for this reason that there can never be an Akbarian tariqa as such, unless it were to describe those who have lost themselves, or perhaps better, found themselves in God. Due to time, I am going to leave out the next section, and I want to concentrate more on the late prose work in Arabic, Mawa'id al-Irfan wa Awa'id al-Ihsan, because it's here that Niyazi's Akbarian thought naturally comes to the fore. Curiously, this work, written in Arabic, is extremely difficult to find in printed form, and I can only hope that some of the scholars here will take it on themselves to produce a new edition. When I started out, I had to rely on the Turkish translation of Süleyman Ateş, but 3 days ago I was able to correlate this with the Arabic version which is held in the Süleymaniye Library. In the Mawa'id, Niyazi often mentions his sources, not always referencing his quotations. The style of the work is a series of 71 contemplations, often taking a Quranic ayah as a starting point. The title itself refers to the 5th surah, Al-Ma'idah, which is the singular of Mawa'id, often translated into English very misleadingly as table. It includes the famous prayer of Jesus, "O God, our Lord, send down upon us a ma'idah from heaven, a banquet from heaven. It shall be an ever-recurring feast for us, for the first and the last of us, and a sign from you." The word mawa'id denotes tables laden with food, and also has a root meaning conferring benefit upon somebody, providing provisions, and so on. So here, Niyazi, in his title, is referring to these heavenly banquets as those of irfan, wisdom, direct knowing of God. And the recurring feasts which Jesus asked for, the Eid, are here changed into an alternative rhyming form, awa'id, meaning beneficences, gifts, acts of kindness. And these are related to ihsan, which we can translate somehow as virtue, but really the idea of right action, worshipping God as if you see him. So the title of this work summarizes Niyazi's approach. Knowing God and acting in full accord with the weight of that knowledge. So we might translate it into English as the heavenly banquets of direct knowing and the beneficent favors of right action. And we can note an interesting spiritual connection to Jesus, which permeates the work. Not Jesus in the sense of a prophet prior to Muhammad, but as symbol of the Spirit who revives the dead, who gives the life of knowledge to those in ignorance of reality. The dichotomy of single and multiple, inner and outer, suggested by the names Niyazi and Mısrî, appears in another form in the Mawa'id. In Banquet 47, he discusses the extraordinary nature of reality as being one and yet appearing as many at the same time. And I'm going to abbreviate this quote, partly because what I used from the original Turkish turns out to be a fairly loose translation of the original Arabic, which is highly complex, and we don't have time to go into it in detail. But let me just put one small part of it in. He says, reality, hakkında, and unique essence are one, and there is no multiplicity in it. And he then lists a whole array of ways of viewing reality. So if you look at the reality that appears in any way, you say it is hak in terms of being reality, and it is khalq in terms of appearance. And so on and so on. He says it's one of the most amazing things that so many different aspects enter into a single reality. He is constantly revealing himself in the forms of things throughout eternity. If that reality should manifest in a specific form, don't forget that it is also he who manifests in all other forms. All of these belong to him, according to what he is in his reality and the perspective of the viewer. Be amazed at this, hayra. And if you realize this completely, do not be amazed, because he exists in his essence without there being any other than him in existence. End of quotation. So we have a statement of unity and multiplicity leading directly to amazement or perplexity, hayra, which of course recalls Ibn Arabi's equally forceful exposition of the nature of perplexity in the face of supra-rational reality. This perplexity is the sign of true comprehension. And where it is not found, one can infer that the real nature of Tawheed has not been tasted or understood. Strangely, the dichotomy of unity and diversity is one that appears in multiple ways throughout the work of Ibn Arabi and Niyazi and other mystics. There are thousands of ways to affirm the central fact of Tawheed. It's often imagined with the mind that Tawheed is some kind of monolith, a single stone-like belief that lies at the fundamental basis of religiousness, like, for example, the God who is found in the mosque, but not in the bazaar, in the chapel, but not in the home, in the synagogue, but not in the self. Such constructs lead directly to non-acceptance of any belief that apparently contradicts our own. That such a situation is logically absurd. We believe in tolerance, and yet we behave intolerantly. We believe in love of God, and yet we cannot love our neighbor. This is put rather graphically by Ibn Arabi in his Tajalliyat. How many walk upon the earth, and the earth curses them? How many prostrate upon her, and she rejects them? How many invoke God, yet their words go no further than their lips, their thoughts no further than their mind? End of quotation. The heart of mysticism is to go beyond this kind of divided thinking and living, beyond the religiousness of do's and don'ts, beyond practices to deep experience and realizations. It is essentially about the cultivation of a relationship with the true self through our own self-knowledge. And of course, this is universally relevant to every human being, since it involves a close analysis of how we behave, think, treat ourselves and others, and a thorough appreciation of our deepest potential. This characteristic, Akbarian emphasis on the immense dignity of man as Insan al-Kamil, and the consequent critique of our present state of division and pretension, is greatly needed as an antidote to the widespread suffering and ignorance that humans are prey to and is so evident today. I would like to finish by just emphasizing this point of the importance of man by quoting from Banquet 1, where Niyazi is discussing the saying, this is a saying, by the way, by Al-Jilani, when poverty is complete, that is God. And Niyazi writes, the completion of poverty is to revoke being from everything except God. When being is removed, the haq is seen and never disappears. Being is one, but it has many levels. At one level, it appears as the lover, at another as the beloved. At one level, it is the rose, at another, the nightingale. He then quotes the famous verses at the very beginning of the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, which encapsulate the paradox of being truly human, where total freedom is only found within the prescriptions that are divinely ordained. And the lines in translation are, the Lord is real, haq, and the servant is real, haq. Would that I knew who is the obligated one. If you say the servant, he is dead. And if you say the Lord, how can he be obligated? For Niyazi, the resolution of this apparent paradox is, and I quote, all being is actually God's. To confer being on creatures is only metaphorical. If he knows that his self has no existence, he realizes that what being he has belongs to God. End of quote. To be Akbarian, then, means nothing less than accepting the full weight of the meaning which Ibn Arabi represents, the meaning of the perfect man, and realizing within one's own being the impact of being completely fakir towards God, a perfect servant who has no separate existence left and is nothing but the place of manifestation of the Lord. As Niyazi puts it, even his own names are veils over his reality. And the last couplet I will try in Turkish. First in English. Though in multiplicity I am called Niyazi, in the world of oneness, the secret of God I become. Şimdi kesrete olan adım Niyazi söylenir, alemi vahdet içinde sirri yezdan olurum. Çok teşekkürler.